Back here on the Ultimate Dallas Sports Show, and we are just 24 hours away from Jerry Jones and company blazing the stage in Oxnard, California for the annual State of the Team press conference as we launch into Cowboys Training Camp 2026. First practice is on Wednesday, but today the players arrive in Southern California. They get, checked into their rooms and get all ready to go. And we've got Ed Werder hanging out with us for the next however long to kind of regale us with some stories and memories of Cowboys camps past, but also we got to take a look at, the squad that's, setting up for 2026, which, Ed, we were talking at the start of the show, or I think on our midday hit on WFAA. This is the first time I feel like in many years there isn't some cloud hanging over this franchise, and that vibes are, dare I say, good going into camp. Do you agree with that assessment or no?
Well, it seems to me like, football and creating the right roster, hiring the right staff for Brian Schottenheimer has been the point of emphasis this entire offseason. There hasn't been the contract drama that usually plays out in these training camps, even though, George Pickens is not signed to a multi-year deal and is the only player in the entire league who's going to play on the franchise tag this year. He seems to have accepted, if not embraced, being the only player in the league being treated unfairly in the way that is legal in the NFL. For teams to take advantage of one player financially. So, yeah, I think to me the biggest accomplishment this offseason for the Cowboys has been that, Jerry Jones and the front office really seems to have demonstrated they trust Brian Schottenheimer to hire his own coaches after the failure of Matt Eberflus, who was appointed by Jerry and Steven on defense last year. To allow him to hire his coaches and then go, acquire, sign, draft players who have histories with some members of the assistant coaching staff, under the new defensive coordinator, the fourth in 4 years, Christian Parker. So I think to me that's been the biggest thing. Now, Jerry's probably going to say something tomorrow that's going to attract a lot of attention. But he's been, much less visible, less controversial. And I think that's a positive for the Cowboys.
I just want to know if he's going to flip off reporters again while telling us a story about a landman scene that was cut because it was, I guess too good. But, yeah, I mean, Ed, you mentioned that, there's no long-term deal with Pickens and they don't sort of have that distraction going into camp. I do think back to, what was it, a few years ago, and Zach Martin all of a sudden, started holding out because he wanted more money. Is there a chance that anything like that happens and that all of us getting prepared for kind of a drama-free start to Cowboys camp could all of a sudden get, rear-ended?
Well, traditionally, that's been the approach that players who aren't satisfied with their contracts have taken. Ezekiel Elliott did it. CeeDee Lamb did it. You mentioned Zach Martin shockingly did it, given the sort of character and relationship he had with the organization. You got to leave open the possibility of a surprise. Dak Prescott played on the franchise tag, but he attended camp and participated fully. We know what happened with Micah Parsons last year and how badly that went and how detrimental the outcome of that contract dispute was for this franchise and will continue to affect the franchise in all likelihood for the next 5 to 10 years, in my opinion, losing a generational pass rusher of his ability. But, you got to leave anything could happen. You could have a serious injury in camp. We've had those happen over the years. But it's good that it seems like everybody's prepared to report. We assume Pickens is going to, report because his contract depends on it. He has been a participant in the mandatory mini camp. So I think it'll be good for Dak Prescott to have his full complement of offensive supporting players to, develop timing with and get this offense prepared to play well from week one on.
Ed, I'm just curious, your experience with Oxnard, does it feel like the beginning of football season in a lot of ways, like that kind of demarcation, the moment when you arrived in California? And what were the moments that you remember most from being out there?
Yeah, obviously the things I remember best were my first years covering the team back in 1989 when I came to Dallas to work for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and when I returned in '92 to work for the Dallas Morning News, and them being in these brutal conditions and in Austin, Texas, where there really were very few rules that limited what coaches could put their players through, how often they could practice. Now there's they have this ramp up periods. They have ideal weather conditions, out in Southern California. And yeah, I remember, Daryl Johnston in Austin saying, "Hey, I'm in the best shape of my life the day I report to camp, and I'm in the worst shape of my life at the end of training camp when the season's about to begin." But it just seemed like that environment that Jimmy Johnson created, the competitiveness, the physical elements that were brought into it. I mean, they ran the Oklahoma drill with Emmitt Smith and Tony Casillas and Charles Haley. So all of that
Charles
seemed
Haley.
to produce a team that was really physically and mentally tough, one of the best in the league in that regard. And that's been lost through, the limitations the NFLPA and the management council has put on coaches now as far as how much they can do in an off season, what the limitations are in training camp, in giving players days off, limits to 2-a-days. All of those things are much different than when I first started covering the team. I think maybe the best story I remember happened out in Oxnard. And it wasn't that long ago. I was working for ESPN, and I had a scheduled sit-down interview with Jerry Jones. And he was late, as he habitually is. And so eventually, after a certain point, I started looking for him out there. And I started walking toward the lobby to the Residence Inn to inquire as to his whereabouts and schedule modification. And I ran across Jim Maurer, and the trainer, and he said, "I said, have you seen Jerry?" He said, "Yeah, he's in the lobby of the hotel with Barry Switzer and Brian Bosworth." And I said, "Switzer's here?" This was obviously after Switzer was the head coach. I think Mike McCarthy was the head coach at the time. So I walk into the lobby, and there's Switzer and Bosworth and Jerry. And I acted surprised to see Switzer, even though I wasn't. I had been forewarned that he was there. And he says, "That's right, Werder, Barry's back." And I said, "Oh, are you?" And he said, "Yeah." He says, "I've caught your act on TV." Because I wrote for the paper when he was the head coach, so I hadn't really seen him much since then. And he and I always didn't have a great relationship because I was a Jimmy guy. You were either a Jerry guy or a Jimmy guy. And so he says, "Yeah, I've caught your act on TV." And I says, "Oh, is that what it is, an act?" And he goes, "Yeah." And he says, "Let me tell you something. Ain't nearly as effing good without me toting guns through the airport for you."
Oh, my goodness. Those times have changed. Ed, I have a question for you. When you pull all the family around, the kiddos, and you want to, tell them the fire stories or the campfire stories, which one do you normally pick out of the old backpack from training camp that gets the good laughs, or is kind of like, "Can you believe this happened to me," etc., that sort of thing?
Well, the one I think that had the most gravity was the off season after the breakup of Jimmy and Jerry and the hiring of Switzer. Back then, like, you didn't have. I was a straight, news reporter. We had real rules of journalism that were enforced when you had a writing position at a paper as prestigious as the Dallas Morning News. And so I wasn't allowed as a beat writer to really have a lot of commentary. That was reserved for the columnists, Randy Galloway and Frank Luxa and Kevin Sherrington and people like that. And so Jerry and the front office, they were really just used to me, not voicing my opinion, with the exception of being on Randy Galloway's weekly firing line show on WBAP. I didn't get to express a lot of opinion, but I wrote a piece that off season for a magazine, Inside Sports Magazine. And I wrote about the Jimmy Jerry breakup. And I wrote it honestly, and it probably contained a little more opinion in the writing than the Jerry and his family were used to. And the first paragraph was something to the effect of, for all his wealth and power and influence, Jerry Jones will forever want the one thing he can never have. He'd rather be Jimmy Johnson. And Jerry was infuriated by that. And I hadn't seen him in a number of, since the article came out, until the first day of training camp. And he sees me, he approaches me, he sticks his finger in my chest repeatedly, tells me how much he hated that story, that it was something somebody would write if they were leaving Dallas and going to New York and never going to report on the Cowboys ever again. But he said, I could be punitive, but I'm not going to be punitive. I was like, well, that's very magnanimous of Jerry. I really appreciate that. And didn't believe it for 1 second. And the next day I see Jerry with the reporter that worked for our rival, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, Mike Fisher. And Fisher had his notebook tucked into the back of his shorts, was quizzing Jerry. They were having a long conversation. I was eagerly watching because I wanted to get to Jerry and find out, I wanted to go through the whole list of stories I thought he could hurt me on. And one of them was Tom Landry. Have you made a decision about, improving your relationship with Tom Landry and finally putting him in the Cowboys Ring of Honor? And Jerry said to me, no, he had no such anticipation of doing so, hadn't thought about it. It's a one-man voting committee. It's entirely up to him. Nope, that's not happening as far as he knows. Next morning in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram 1A story, Jerry putting Tom Landry in the Ring of Honor. So that was Jerry's payback to me, and that's the story that most resonates from training camp coverage for me for a lot of reasons. And then the next day at practice in Austin, I'm with Tim Calishaw. He's my co-beat writer, and he's less emotional than me, and he's trying to calm me down, and he's saying maybe it's not what we think it is, because we've been ripped by our sports editor Dave Smith, a very illustrious sports editor, called us first thing in the morning, maybe it's the last thing at night. Just furious about the story that we'd gotten beaten on and wanted to know how it happened and why. And so I'm patiently waiting for practice to end. But before it does, the PR staff goes down the line with the media present, hands out this release that says, remember, we're in Austin. There's going to be a press conference at Texas Stadium that night to make an announcement regarding Tom Landry. So Tom Landry's going in the ring. I can't wait to get to Jerry. And the second practice ends, keeping in mind, Calishaw telling me to be mindful of my rhetoric and my hostility toward Jerry in the moment. So I said, Jerry, I feel strongly, holding up the paper, that if this announcement is that you're putting Tom Landry in the Ring of Honor, then you misrepresented what you told me yesterday when I obviously felt like he outright lied to me. You misrepresented what you told me. He looks at me, he smirks, he smiles, having gotten his retribution. He says, you're a liar. You're immoral. and I said, hey, Jerry, I honestly said this too. I said, Jerry, anytime you want to, let's hook up to some lie detectors at midfield and
bring the FBI
and those being
in.
The topics, we'll both answer questions about morality and honesty and integrity. So that was my most memorable story.
I love it. Oh my goodness.
We were looking for positive stories. And it's just, we got an axe to grind.
You didn't say that.
Well, I mean, come on.
Well, I mean, I feel like that's also very, very true of what can happen at Cowboys training camp. I mean, anything can go down.
It's
you remember when Dale Hansen was out there with Switzer, right? And they did the Sunday Sports Special, and Switzer barely hits Hansen on the arm, and Hansen turns it into some big, huge thing. So, anything could happen. Barry Switzer could tote a gun through an airport.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that clip probably 1,000 times.
We have. You've reminded us of something we are very familiar with.
People, I mean, let's grade it. Was it a punch? Was it a firm,
I don't know.
Firm smack?
In the terms of WWE wrestling, I'm going to put it as a Ric Flair, woo! Like, I'm going to put it in that term, like a slap.
It's just a really aggressive, enthusiastic smack punch.
More than once, too. It wasn't just like the one time. He went back to the well at least twice.
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't like it's not.
I'll bet you Switzer's punched people harder than that.
Oh yeah, 100%, 100%. No one is questioning that part of it. But sometimes you don't know your own strength.
It wasn't a bar fight.
No.
No, but Dale probably knew he had TV gold the moment his arm got touched.
That's
so,
true.
That played a role. And Cowboys camp is unique because for the vast majority of NFL teams, they're doing it in their own facility in whatever city they're at, or maybe they're going an hour and a half away to some community college or smaller school. The Cowboys go all the way to Oxnard, California, and kind of tap into the California, Mexico fan base. Just sort of through the years, how unique have you found that is, part of Cowboys lore? Because I can think on my hand just how many times I've seen the Cowboys do training camp back here, and it's been very rare. I think the COVID season was maybe the last time they've done it back here, but outside of that, it's been Oxnard, California for decades now.
Yeah, that's sort of become their identity in the off season, is to have camp out there, and the coaches obviously embrace the idea of the weather conditions and their sense that players are in better physical condition entering the season when they do it out there, and even when they move it back here, they have a lot of practices indoors. So I guess as long as you're not opening up against Philadelphia in the Dave Campo era and it's 110 degrees on the field and they have pickle juice and you don't, you can succeed despite the conditions. They think that players are able to be more connected mentally when they're not suffering physically. I think Jimmy Johnson would tell you that's not true, even though when they were in Texas, and they were in a lot of places in Texas, we talked to Nate Newton, he'd lose 16 pounds in a day at practices. So the body just is not challenged and compromised out there like it was when they were in Texas doing training camp. Whether that has an effect on producing a mentally tough team, like I said, I think it does. I don't know. But we haven't seen them have the kind of success for a lot of reasons, and since they moved out to California. But the Landry Cowboys practiced out there too, and they had enormous amount of success. In fact, my first year at training camp out there was, it wasn't in Oxnard, it was Thousand Oaks back in the Landry era. And Jimmy's first year was there. And I remember going into Tex Schramm's office, his room, at the hotel, which overlooked the practice field. And one half of it was a hotel room and one half of it was an open bar.
Is there any hope? Because I come from, or my former station was the San Antonio market, and when they hosted, obviously there was a giant cricket epidemic, which I didn't hear about until a couple of years after I left San Antonio. But there's always a push to try and bring the Cowboys back to Texas. Is there any hope that they will bring training camp back here, or is it permanently attached at the hip, do you think, to Oxnard?
I don't know. I think as long as Jerry's making, that decision, and his financial partners are making it worth his time to have training camp out there and endure whatever expense there is in housing a team and, moving so many people out that way, and all the, weight room equipment and so forth that has to be on site. I think they're very comfortable with what they're doing out there, and I would expect this partnership to continue for, as long as Jerry Jones is the owner.
I have one more question, Ed. Who would win in an Oklahoma drill, Dale Hansen or Barry Switzer?
I think Barry Switzer would win quite decisively, no matter how many times they ran it.
What about
more
you?
Decisively every time they ran it.
What about you and Dale? You got some height, man. Yeah, you got some height, man.
I don't want to offend Dale, but even in my current form, I think he outweighs me significantly.
You're
leave it
too
at
modest. You're too modest, Ed. You got a good frame, dude. I've stood next to you before. You'd be a tough man to take down.
Matt and I were actually talking about this yesterday with Dia when we were hanging out during daybreak, and every year you hear, "This is our year." And every year it's not. But for me,
only for 30 years is that?
Only for 30 years.
No, only for most of our lives.
Yeah, it's been a couple decades.
Not most of my life.
Well,
yeah,
you're right. Excuse me. I apologize.
For some reason, and I don't know that I can explain it, and I don't know that I can quantify it. But like for me, at least, the vibe feels different. And I don't know how your sense going into the season is.
Well, I think that the difference is, they don't have a significant player engaged against the front office in a contract dispute. And it seems, like I said, that they're trusting the coaches in a way that has been uncommon in the Jerry Jones era. And anytime, you have an elite quarterback like they do with Dak Prescott, and you have, surrounded him with weapons at wide receiver and running back that he has, then I think you have a chance in the NFL, especially in a division that's really not that good. To me, it's either Philadelphia or Dallas, even though the NFC Championship game 2 years ago was Washington and Philadelphia. But I do think that despite all of the positivity and the expectation, these guys have talked about, the players have talked about having great culture, for any number of years. This is the greatest locker room I've been a part. They say that every year. But it ultimately comes down to winning big games and winning on the road. And all of that is mainly often determined by the health of the team, especially the quarterback. And Dak Prescott's, past 30. They had him for 17 games last year. They're 14, 19, and 1 the last 2 years. They were 1-5-1 against teams with a winning record last year. Their defense has been the worst in the NFL 2 years in a row. Over the past 2 years, they've allowed the most points by like 43. So how far can they go in rebuilding the defense in a single offseason? To me, that's really the key. You got a young defensive coordinator. He's never done this before. He's never called plays. He's never made the final determination of who's going to play where and what roles on defense. He hasn't ever game planned before. So as much excitement as there is about him, he's never done this before. And they've had significant personnel turnover on that side of the ball, which could be a good thing. But to me, they still really don't have a pass rusher on the edge. Quinnen Williams certainly inside can be an excellent pass rusher. There's a huge amount of questions at corner going into the season. Now that's where, Christian Parker has done his best work. I think Brian Schottenheimer said, hey, this guy's a stud, across the board on defense, but he's a superstar in the secondary. Well, they need that to be reflected early on. They have they had a healthy elite quarterback last year for 17 games, what proved to be the second easiest schedule in the league. They had an elite offense and they did nothing with it. They could not overcome their own defense. So how much improvement can we expect in 1 year from a defense? Now, they did it in 2021 when they hired Dan Quinn and they drafted Micah Parsons. But Quinn was an experienced defensive coach, and Parsons was a really unique pass rusher.
So Ed Werder not vibing.
Yeah, that distilled.
I
That
was
was
so
you're
shut
saying
down.
There's a chance.
That was pump the brakes.
So
He was
you're
like, I'm going to tell
saying
you all the reasons
there's a
why you're wrong,
chance.
Kelly. Just hold on.
Seriously,
You
on that
could
same
totally
front,
be right. You can't. Nobody can predict the outcome of these seasons.
on that-
If Dak Prescott's healthy again and the defense is average, then they can win the division.
Easily.
yeah.
But the thing I took away from that documentary on Netflix, Jerry and his the Gambler and his Cowboys, the thing that really ultimately I walked away from with that was
Great
I was
cinematography.
awed, and I covered those teams. I remained awed by how the best players on those teams on both sides of the ball played their very best, delivered their best performances in the biggest games, the most consequential moments, and beat the best opponents there were in football to get to and win Super Bowls. And we haven't seen that characteristic in any team since in the last 31 years.
Ed, I do want to ask, because I do feel like Schottenheimer got a pass last year for the team's performance because of the hand he was dealt preseason, and also because of the way the offense performed. What is a year two step up from him that you feel like is the baseline that you want to see progress from him and just the team as a whole?
Well, I think he demonstrated that he endured a lot of crises during the season, including, the death of Marshawn Nealon, having his best defensive player, Micah Parsons, traded exactly a week before they opened the season at Philadelphia. And he embraced all of those things. So I think he's capable of leading players and galvanizing players in difficult circumstances. And, we knew before he took over that he could call plays, but he's very compatible and very popular with the offensive personnel. I think he demonstrated an aggressiveness most of the year that had been lacking in the Mike McCarthy era. He wants to run the football, and he did run the football last year, and yet Dak Prescott still led the NFL in passing attempts, and you had, Javonte Williams with a 1,200-yard rushing season. So I think he's proven almost everything. I would say sometimes I question, all the party, element at practices, the music, the dancing, and you can argue that he's maybe too close to his players. That's not the way Bill Belichick was. That's not the way Bill Parcells was. That's not the way Jimmy Johnson was. I'm not sure that's the way Sean McVay is. Pete Carroll was, certainly that way. So you can win doing it both ways. And I think he proved a lot last year because he was really challenged in ways that we expected and ways nobody could have anticipated. And he came through it. But, yeah, he's got to win. I don't think they can have a third straight losing season and Brian Schottenheimer, return as the head coach. So to a certain extent, I think his future as the Cowboys head coach could well be determined by how they play and what they accomplish this year.
Interesting.
I think Ed Werder's ready for week 1.
I think he is too. You got so much stuff loaded, ready to go, man.
Yeah, we're just getting training camp started. A little bit of ways
Nothing's
to go.
happened yet.
I know.
I thought we were just going to reminisce during all of this.
We are, and we're reminiscing, and it's the hope that kills you. And for Cowboys fans, for the last 30 years, it's been a better battle to try to find the positives. But one of the positives is there are no distractions heading into camp just yet. And
it's true.
Just yet.
That's for
Just
now.
yet.
And
We've got 48
I have
hours.
to keep hedging it at the end of every sentence is for now, and nothing's changed.
And
yet.
everybody's still healthy so far.
That's
For
true.
now, yes. So let's we'll probably readdress this come week 1 in terms of the vibe check. But hey, we'll take the wins where we can get them, and going into training.
If they
camp, it
win, they'll
certainly
be
seems
Super
good.
Bowl bound, and if they lose, it'll be here we go again.
That's exactly
That's
right.
the way it works, baby.
Yep.
Ride the roller coaster.
Ed Werder, we appreciate you, pal. We'll be sure to talk to you throughout this upcoming Cowboys season.